Empires do not fall the way history books pretend. There is no single army that arrives and simply wins. What really happens is quieter and far more disturbing. The structure rots from the inside, slowly, silently, until the moment someone from the outside barely has to push. And in almost every case, the rot begins with one person at the top making one decision that should never have been made. These are 5 of those decisions, and the wreckage they left behind has never fully been cleaned up. In 480 BC, the most powerful man alive stood at the edge of a narrow strip of water and watched his engineers build a road across the sea. His name was Xerxes. His empire stretched from Egypt to the edges of India. He commanded more gold, more land, and more soldiers than any human being in recorded history. And he was about to throw a piece of all of it into the ocean, not out of necessity, but out of inherited pride. His father had sent a force to punish a cluster of quarrelsome Greek city-states a decade earlier and returned humiliated from a beach called Marathon. Xerxes did not send a second punishment force. He sent everything. The army he assembled was so vast that ancient writers lost the ability to count it accurately. To move them across the water, he built 2 bridges from hundreds of ships lashed together, planked over, packed with earth. When a storm destroyed the first attempt, he reportedly ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times and had his engineers beheaded. That detail is worth pausing on. This was a man so accustomed to absolute obedience that he attempted to discipline the ocean. And that precise instinct, the belief that the world answers to power rather than logic, was the thing that was about to end his campaign, because an army that size eats, it drinks. Every single day it needs to be fed, and the further it marches from home, the thinner the line supplying it becomes. The entire invasion was a single enormous organism, kept alive by a thread of ships shadowing the coast. When the Greek fleet, outnumbered and cornered in the narrow Strait of Salamis, chose their battlefield deliberately, knowing Persian numbers would become a curse in a cramped channel, the thread snapped in an afternoon. Xerxes watched from a throne on a hillside as hundreds of his ships tangled and sank. The moment the navy broke, the math was simple. No fleet meant no supply line. No supply line meant that the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled was now a starving mob stranded in hostile territory with winter approaching. He ran. The army he left behind to finish the conquest was destroyed the following year. The richest empire on earth had not been defeated by a stronger empire. It had been defeated by its own scale, administered by a man who never once considered that everything he had built was being kept alive by something that could be cut. 65 years later, and 1,000 miles to the west, a democracy at the absolute height of its power made a different kind of mistake, one driven not by arrogance about nature but by arrogance about itself. Athens, in 415 BC, was the dominant naval force in the Greek world, rich, confident, and locked in a long grinding war with Sparta that a fragile truce was barely containing. The obvious move was to hold. Instead, the city fell in love with a dream. A young aristocrat named Alcibiades stood before the assembly and described a prize waiting to the west. Syracuse, the great city of Sicily, rich in grain and silver, ripe for conquest. Take Syracuse, he argued, and Athens would have the resources to end the war with Sparta forever and rule the entire Greek world. An older general named Nicias stood up and tried to stop it. He warned that Sicily was enormous, distant, and populated by cities that would not simply surrender. In a miscalculation that haunts the historical record, he attempted a trick. He told the assembly that if they truly insisted on going, they would need a force far larger than anyone imagined, hoping the cost would frighten them into reason. It did the opposite. The assembly heard the numbers and grew more excited. They voted to go bigger, and placed Nicias, the man who believed the expedition was doomed, in command of it. The fleet that sailed was genuinely breathtaking. Over 100 warships, thousands of soldiers, the best of Athenian manpower rowing west while the entire city lined the harbor to watch. Before the fighting began, Alcibiades, the architect of the plan, was recalled to face a religious trial. Rather than return, he defected to Sparta and began advising the enemy. The expedition lost its only true believer before it made landfall. What followed was a siege that stalled, reinforcements that doubled a losing position, and then a trap that closed so completely it left no exit. The Athenian fleet, the source of everything, was defeated in the very harbor they were meant to conquer. The army that had no ships attempted to retreat by land and was systematically destroyed. Those who survived were herded into stone quarries on a hostile island and left to die of heat and disease. Of the tens of thousands who had sailed out in that glittering armada, almost none returned. Athens continued for a few years more, but the expedition had consumed the core of its naval power and the flower of a generation. A city that had seemed untouchable had voted, openly and enthusiastically, to destroy itself. The third mistake is slower, more structural, and in many ways the most instructive because it disguised itself as a solution. In 107 BC, a Roman general named Gaius Marius faced a straightforward military problem. Rome needed more soldiers than it had eligible citizens to provide. The traditional requirement was property ownership. You fought for the Republic because you had a stake in it. Marius removed the requirement. He opened the legions to the landless poor and let the state arm them. It looked like administrative efficiency. It was a transfer of power so fundamental that Rome would spend the next century dying from it. A soldier who owns nothing is not defending his farm. He fights for pay and for the promise of land upon retirement. The entity providing that pay and that land is not the distant impersonal Senate. It is the general standing in front of him. In one reform, Marius quietly redirected the loyalty of the Roman army from the Republic to individual commanders. A generation later, a general named Sulla used legions loyal to him personally to march on Rome itself, something previously unthinkable, and took the city by force. He posted lists in the forum. Anyone named on them could be legally killed for a reward. The taboo had been broken and everyone had seen it. After Sulla, the dominoes fell with a kind of grim inevitability. Powerful men with personal armies carved the Republic into competing zones of control. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC, a river that marked the legal boundary no general was permitted to cross with his army, and his soldiers followed him because they were his soldiers, not Rome's. The Senate killed him on the floor of their own chamber, but killing the man solved nothing. The system was already gone. The civil wars that followed ended only when one man, Octavian, won the final round and became Augustus, the first emperor. The Roman Republic was not conquered. It was consumed from within by its own legions because one general solved a recruiting problem by quietly answering the question of who soldiers actually serve. The Mongol Empire made a different kind of structural error, not in who the army served, but in who the empire itself would serve after its founder was gone. By 1227, Genghis Khan had built something the world had never seen and has never seen since, a contiguous land empire stretching from the Pacific coast of China toward the Caspian Sea, administered with genuine sophistication, tolerant of religion, efficient in communication, and militarily without peer on earth. What he had not built was a clear binding rule for succession. The Mongol tradition required a grand council, a kurultai, to gather after a great Khan's death and choose the next leader from the family. In theory, this selected the most capable man. In practice, it meant that every powerful prince with an army believed he carried a legitimate claim. While Genghis lived, his authority held the structure together. His chosen successor Ogadai took power, and the conquests continued. But the mechanism was structural, not personal, and it widened with every generation. When a great Khan died, campaigns thousands of miles away were abandoned. Armies literally reversed direction, so their commanders could attend the kurultai and protect their position. A full invasion of Western Europe was reportedly halted for exactly this reason. Then came 1259 and a succession dispute between two brothers, Kublai and Arik Boke, that no rule could settle cleanly. They settled it with war. Kublai won, but the unity did not survive the winning. The empire that had moved as one organism split into four separate khanates: China, the Russian steppe, Persia, the Central Asian interior, each drifting into its own religion, its own alliances, its own slow decline. The machine that had terrified the entire Eurasian landmass was never defeated in a single decisive confrontation. It simply came apart at the joints because the man who built it never answered the one question every empire eventually faces: who is in charge when you are gone? The Ottoman mistake is the most ordinary of the five, which is perhaps why it is the hardest to see clearly even now. After the failed siege of Vienna in 1683, something in the balance of power between the Ottomans and Europe quietly, permanently shifted. The empire that had twice marched to the gates of that city, that had taken Constantinople and ended the last fragment of Rome, that had out-organized and outfought European kingdoms for centuries. That empire stopped evolving while everything around it accelerated. The Janissaries, an elite infantry corps that had been the sword of Ottoman expansion, became a privileged institution more focused on protecting its own status than on military effectiveness. When sultans attempted to modernize, to adopt European drill, new weapons, updated tactics, the Janissaries and allied conservative factions resisted, sometimes with open violence, because modernization threatened what they had. Printing was restricted for generations, while Europe used it to spread knowledge, coordinate science, and accelerate every field of human understanding. Banking systems that allowed European states to borrow at scale and fund massive armies were absent. The scientific and later industrial revolutions that transformed European manufacturing, logistics, and warfare proceeded without Ottoman participation. Each generation could look at the situation and tell itself it remained manageable. Each generation was wrong by a larger margin than the one before. By the 19th century, European diplomats were openly discussing the Ottoman state as the sick man of Europe, an entity whose territory they were already privately arranging to divide. The reformers who finally came, frantically attempting to modernize the military and the administration in the empire's final decades, were working against a deficit of centuries. The First World War completed what the slow divergence had begun, and an empire that had endured for more than 600 years dissolved into the borders that define the modern Middle East. Place all five beside each other, and the pattern is almost uncomfortably clear. A king who believed the universe operated under his authority and forgot that his army required food. A city intoxicated by its own power that voted to consume its best generation chasing a dream in a foreign harbor. A republic that transferred the loyalty of its military to individual men and discovered those men were ambitious. A conqueror who built the largest empire in history and never specified who inherited it. An empire that mistook institutional stability for strength, while the world it competed in was remade around it. None of them were destroyed by a superior outside force. Each one provided the instrument of its own dissolution, and in nearly every case the fatal decision was made not at a moment of weakness, but at or near the peak, when the institution had become so accustomed to succeeding that it had lost the ability to imagine being wrong. That is the detail history keeps trying to teach, and power keeps refusing to learn. The most dangerous moment for anything that has grown very strong is not the moment of vulnerability. It is the moment after the last victory, when it becomes genuinely convinced that losing is something that happens to other empires.